He thought he was discarding a trophy wife. He didn't realize he was declaring war on his own boss. Meet Julian Thorne, CEO, billionaire, and narcissist. On Christmas Eve, he handed his wife, Annie, divorce papers, thinking he was about to trade her in for a younger model and take their company public alone. He forgot one tiny detail: the mysterious angel investor who owns the controlling stake in his empire. It's not a bank, it's not a hedge fund. It's the woman sitting across the dinner table. And she's not just taking half, she's taking it all. The heating in the Aspen chalet was set to a perfect 72 degrees, but the air in the living room felt cold enough to crack the floor-to-ceiling glass that overlooked the dark, snowy peaks of the Rockies. Annie Thorne sat on the edge of the cream-coloured Roche-Beaubois sofa, her posture perfect, her expression unreadable. In her hand, she held a crystal tumbler of vintage Krug, the bubbles rising in a slow, hypnotic line. She wasn't drinking it. She was just watching the physics of it, grounding herself in the reality of the moment, because what her husband, Julian, had just placed on the coffee table felt like a hallucination. It wasn't a jewelry box. It wasn't the keys to the new Bentley Continental GT he had been hinting at for months. It was a thick, manila envelope. The legal kind. Julian stood by the fireplace, swirling a glass of Macallan 25. He looked every inch the tech visionary of the year, a title Forbes had bestowed upon him just last month. He was 42, handsome in a jagged, aggressive way, with hair that was artfully greying at the temples, and a bespoke Tom Ford tuxedo that cost more than most people's cars. He looked triumphant. That was the only word for it. "It's better this way, Elle," he said, his voice smooth, lacking even a tremor of guilt. "We've drifted. You know it. I know it. Thorne Dynamics is about to IPO. The roadshow starts in January. I need a clean slate. I need focus." Annie finally looked up from her champagne. Her eyes, usually a warm hazel, were flat. "A clean slate," she repeated, her voice low. "Is that what you call 20 years of marriage? A dirty slate that needs wiping?" Julian sighed, the exaggerated sigh of a man burdened by his own genius. "Don't make this emotional, Annie. It's business. My legal team has drawn up a generous settlement. The penthouse in Tribeca, the house in the Hamptons, and a monthly stipend that will keep you in whatever it is you do all day. Pilates? Charity luncheons?" He chuckled, a sound that grated against Annie's soul. "You'll never have to work. Not that you ever really have." Annie placed the glass down on the coaster. She didn't slam it. She placed it. "I see. And the timing. Christmas Eve, Julian." "Really?" "Tax purposes," he said, waving his hand dismissively. "And optics. We file now. The news cycle buries it over the holidays. By the time the markets open in January, it's old news. I walk into the IPO a single man, unencumbered." "Unencumbered," Annie tested the word. "Is that what I am? An encumbrance?" "You're a distraction, Annie," Julian snapped, his facade cracking just a fraction. "Thorne Dynamics is my legacy. I built it. I bled for it. And now that we are about to become a global superpower in AI logistics, I can't have baggage. I need a partner who understands the world I live in." Annie stood up. She was wearing a simple silk slip dress, but she wore it like armor. She walked over to the window, looking out at the snow falling on the private drive where the staff were currently loading Julian's luggage into the waiting Escalade. "A partner," she mused. "Like that girl? The new VP of Communications? Isabella? Is she the partner who understands your world?" Julian froze. "I don't know what you're talking about." "She's 26, Julian. She understands TikTok and how to spend your corporate card at Nobu. She doesn't understand the proprietary algorithms that power the logistics grid. And you do? Julian laughed, a cruel, barking sound. You haven't stepped foot in the office in 5 years, Annie. You plan dinner parties. You pick out curtains. You're a wonderful hostess, truly. But let's not pretend you understand the complexities of what I do. Annie turned to face him. The firelight cast long shadows across her face. Read the papers, Julian. I'll sign them. Julian blinked, surprised by her capitulation. He had expected screaming, tears, perhaps a thrown vase. He had a whole speech prepared about how she was being unreasonable. You will? If that's what you want, a clean break, no spousal support, no alimony. I don't want your charity. Julian's eyes widened. Annie, be reasonable. You need money to live. I have money, Julian. You have my money. I have my own resources, she said softly. Just leave the papers. Go to your mistress. Go to your IPO. But remember this moment, Julian. Remember that I gave you a chance to walk away with dignity. Julian laughed again, relief washing over him. He downed the rest of his scotch. You're trying to sound ominous, Elle. It's cute. But really, you should take the settlement. Don't be a martyr. He walked over, placed a quick, dry kiss on her cheek, a kiss that felt like a branding iron, and picked up his coat. The lawyers will be in touch on Tuesday. Merry Christmas, Annie. The heavy oak door slammed shut. Annie listened to the crunch of tires on snow as the Escalade pulled away. The silence of the house rushed back in, deafening and heavy. She walked back to the coffee table and picked up the envelope. She didn't open it. She tossed it into the fire. She watched the paper curl and blacken, the Thorn Dynamics logo turning to ash. Then she walked over to the hidden wall, safe behind the painting of the French countryside, a painting Julian hated because he called it pedestrian. She entered the code, 1225 Oro 1. The date they met. Inside there was no jewellery. There was a single black leather binder embossed with a silver logo. It wasn't the Thorn Dynamics logo. It was a stylized constellation. The Orion Group. She opened the binder to the first page. It was a legal document dated 7 years ago. Shareholder agreement. Class A preferred stock with super voting rights. Beneficial owner, the Harrington Trust. Trustee, Annie Vance, née Thorn. Annie picked up her phone. It was 11:45 p.m. She dialed a number saved simply as Arthur. Mrs. Thorn? A crisp British voice answered on the first ring. It is late. Merry Christmas, Arthur, Annie said, her voice ice cold. Initiate protocol Icarus. There was a pause on the line. Are you sure, Ma'am? Once we start, there is no going back. It will trigger the clause in the Series B financing. It will freeze the IPO. I don't want to freeze it, Arthur, Annie said, pouring herself another glass of champagne. I want to burn it down. And then I want to buy the ashes. Very good, Ma'am. Shall I alert the board? No. Annie smiled, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Let him have his Christmas. Alert them on Monday morning. I want him to walk into that boardroom thinking he's a king, Arthur. I want him to sit in that chair at the head of the table. And then I want you to walk in. Understood. Annie hung up. She walked to the window and toasted the tail lights fading into the distance. Merry Christmas, Julian. To understand the magnitude of Julian's mistake, you have to go back. Not just a few years, but 20. Julian Thorn was never a genius. He was a salesman. In college, he was the guy who could sell you the answers to a test he hadn't studied for. He had charisma, a jawline that could cut glass, and an ambition that bordered on pathology. But he couldn't code. He couldn't build. He couldn't see the patterns in the data. Annie Vance could. They met at a coffee shop near the Stanford campus. She was a scholarship student, a math prodigy who wore oversized sweaters to hide her figure and kept her head down to hide her intelligence. Julian was the golden boy of the business school, loud and brash. He spilled his latte on her notes. It was a cliché, but it worked. He charmed her. He told her she was beautiful when she took off her glasses. But more importantly, he listened when she talked about her thesis, a predictive algorithm for supply chain logistics based on ant colony behavior. "That's boring," most people would say. "That's $1 billion, Julian said. And he was right. They built Thorn Dynamics in a garage, naturally. But while Julian was out at mixers, shaking hands and securing angel investors with nothing but a smile and a PowerPoint deck, Annie was the one awake at 4 a.m., debugging the kernel that made the whole thing work. When the company launched, Julian became the face. It made sense. He was good on camera. He could speak in sound bites. Annie hated the spotlight. She had severe social anxiety in large crowds. She preferred the quiet hum of the server room. "You be the CEO," she had told him on their wedding night. "I'll be the CTO. We're a team." But as the years went by, the narrative shifted. The media fell in love with Julian. They called him the logistics king. They asked him about the code, and he answered with vague metaphors that sounded profound, but meant nothing. And Annie? She slowly disappeared from the company bios. First, she was co-founder. Then, founding engineer. Then, as the company grew and they brought in real executives from Google and Amazon, she was moved to an advisory role. "It looks better for the investors, Elle," Julian had said 5 years ago. "They get nervous when they see a husband and wife at the top. It screams, mum and pop shop. We need to look corporate. Take a step back. Enjoy the money. Let me handle the stress." She had agreed. She trusted him. She wanted to start a family. But the family never happened. Julian was always too busy. And as Annie stepped back, she noticed things. Discrepancies in the books. Risky loans Julian was taking to fund a lifestyle that was spiraling out of control. Private jets, parties in Ibiza, consulting fees paid to women she didn't know. The company was bleeding cash, despite the hype. They were months away from bankruptcy 7 years ago. Julian was frantic. He needed a massive injection of capital, or the whole house of cards would fall. That was when the Orion Group appeared. Julian thought it was a stroke of luck. A secretive European investment firm approached them, offering a $50 million lifeline in exchange for a 40% equity stake and, crucially, certain veto rights. Julian was so desperate he didn't read the fine print. He didn't care who Orion was. He just saw the check. He signed the papers. He toasted his own brilliance. "I saved us, Annie," he had bragged. He didn't know that the money came from Annie's inheritance. Julian knew Annie's parents were comfortable, professors at Yale. He didn't know that her maternal grandfather was Silas Harrington, a steel magnate who had died estranged from his family, leaving his entire estate in a blind trust for his only granddaughter to be accessed only when she turned 30. Annie had turned 30 the week Thorn Dynamics was about to collapse. She had used the money to save the company, but she didn't trust Julian anymore. She knew he was reckless. So she created the Orion Group. She hired Arthur Penhaligon, her grandfather's shark of a lawyer, to front the operation. For 7 years, Annie had been Julian's boss. Every time he wanted to acquire a competitor, he had to get approval from Orion. Every time he wanted to liquidate stock, he had to ask Orion. He complained about them constantly over dinner. "These Europeans," he would rant, cutting into his steak. "They're so risk-averse. They don't understand vision. But don't worry, Elle. Once we IPO, I'll dilute their shares. I'll regain control." Annie would just smile and pour him more wine. "I'm sure you will, darling." She had protected him. She had kept the company afloat despite his spending. She had hoped, foolishly, that he would mature, that he would remember they were partners. But then came Isabella. Then came the disrespect. Then came the Christmas Eve divorce papers. Julian had broken the one rule of the arrangement. He had stopped being useful. December 28th. The Thorn Dynamics headquarters in San Francisco was a glass monolith piercing the fog. The emergency board meeting had been called by Julian. He wanted to align the troops before the January IPO launch. He walked into the boardroom wearing a navy Brioni suit, looking refreshed and energized. The divorce was in motion. He felt lighter. Around the long mahogany table sat the board members. There was Marcus Sterling, a venture capitalist from Sand Hill Road, who only cared about his 10x return. There was Linda Chen, a tech veteran who asked tough questions, but was easily charmed by Julian. There was Kevin O'Leary, not that one, but a man who desperately wanted to be, who just followed the money. And there was the empty seat at the end of the table, the seat reserved for the representative of the Orion Group. Usually they dialed in via a conference line, a faceless voice that approved or denied motions. Julian stood at the head of the table, flashing his signature grin. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, 2026 is going to be our year. The S1 is filed. The banks are foaming at the mouth. We are looking at a valuation of $4 billion. Applause. Polite nods. However, Julian continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, to maximize our opening price, we need to show the market that we are lean, agile. I am proposing a restructuring of the cap table. He clicked a remote. A slide appeared on the screen. Class B share consolidation. I am proposing that we convert the Class A preferred shares held by our early investors, specifically the Orion Group, into common stock. This will strip them of their super voting rights. It gives me, the founder, the ultimate authority to steer this ship without interference. Marcus Sterling frowned. Julian, Orion saved this company. They hold 40%. They have veto power. They'll never agree to this. They don't have to agree, Julian said, a smirk playing on his lips. I've found a loophole in the Series B bylaws. If the founder can prove material disengagement by a major shareholder, we can force a conversion. Orion hasn't attended a physical meeting in 7 years. They are a ghost ship. We take the vote today. We file the change. By the time they wake up in Europe, the IPO is done, and I'm in control. It's aggressive, Linda Chen noted. Borderline hostile. It's necessary. Julian slammed his hand on the table. Do you want to be managed by a spreadsheet in Zurich, or by the visionary who built this? He looked around the room. He had them. They were greedy. They wanted the IPO to pop just as much as he did. Let's take a vote, Julian said. All in favor of the restructuring? Hands started to go up. Marcus. Kevin. Wait. The voice came from the door. The heavy glass doors swung open. Julian turned, annoyed. I gave strict instructions that we were not to be The words died in his throat. Walking into the room was not a secretary. It was Arthur Penhaligon. He was an older man, impeccable in a Savile Row 3-piece suit, carrying a leather briefcase, and walking right beside him, wearing a white power suit that looked sharp enough to cut skin, was Annie. Julian blinked. His brain couldn't process the image. Annie, what are you doing here? I told you, the lawyers will handle. Sit down, Julian, Annie said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried a weight he had never heard before. It wasn't the voice of his wife. It was the voice of the code. Excuse me? Julian laughed nervously. Gentleman, Linda, I apologize. My wife is taking the separation a bit hard. She's confused. I'm not confused, Mr. Thorne. Annie said, walking past him to the empty seat at the end of the table. The Orion seat. She didn't sit. She stood behind it, resting her hands on the leather. Arthur. She nodded to the lawyer. Arthur Penhaligon cleared his throat. He opened his briefcase and produced a stack of documents, sliding them down the table with practiced precision. "Mr. Thorne," Arthur said, his British accent cutting through the tension, "you are attempting to invoke Clause 14b, material disengagement, to strip the Orion Group of its voting rights." "That's right," Julian sneered, trying to regain composure. "Who are you? Orion's errand boy? Tell your bosses they're out." "I am the legal counsel for the Orion Group," Arthur said calmly. "And I am here to inform you that there has been no disengagement. The beneficial owner of the Orion Group has been intimately involved in the daily operations of this company for the last 7 years. In fact, she has been sleeping in your bed." The room went dead silent. You could hear the hum of the HVAC system. Julian looked at Arthur, then at Annie. He looked like a man trying to read a map in a language he didn't speak. "What?" Annie leaned forward. "I am the Orion Group, Julian." Julian shook his head. No, that's impossible. You do Pilates. You don't have money." "I have the Harrington Trust," Annie said, "and I own 40% of this company. I also own the debt you took out against your personal shares last year to buy that villa in Como. Did you think that was a bank loan? It was a private note. I bought it." She looked around the table at the stunned board members. "We are not converting the shares," Annie announced. "In fact, the Orion Group is exercising its right under the Series B agreement to call for a vote of no confidence in the CEO." "You can't do that!" Julian screamed. He looked frantic now, sweat beading on his forehead. "I am the founder. I am Thorne Dynamics." "You are a mascot, Julian," Annie said coldly, "and you're fired. You need 51% of the vote," Julian shouted, turning to the board. "I own 30%. Marcus, Linda, Kevin, they own the rest. They won't back you. They know I'm the rainmaker." He looked at Marcus Sterling. "Marcus, tell her. If she ousts me, the IPO tanks. The stock goes to zero. You lose everything." Marcus looked at Julian, then at Annie. He did the math. A public fight would destroy the IPO, but Annie held the debt. "She's right about the debt, Julian?" Marcus asked quietly. "It doesn't matter," Julian yelled. "It matters," Annie interjected, "because the terms of the loan state that if the borrower ceases to be an executive of the company, the loan is called immediately. If Julian stays, I call the loan. He defaults. I seize his 30% stake. Then I have 70% control, and I fire him anyway." She smiled, a shark in the water. "Or," she continued, "you vote him out now. I step in as interim CEO. We announce that the founder is moving to a chairman emeritus role to focus on philanthropy. The market remains stable. The IPO proceeds, and you all get rich." She looked at Julian. "Checkmate." Julian looked at his allies. One by one they looked away. Linda Chen was the first to speak. "I motion for a vote on the removal of Julian Thorne as CEO." "Seconded," Marcus said, not making eye contact with Julian. Julian stood there, his mouth open, his hands trembling. The room seemed to be spinning. "Annie," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Please, don't do this. I'm your husband." Annie looked at the man who had burned 20 years of loyalty for a PR girl and a tax break. "Not anymore," she said. "Raise your hands. All in favor?" The walk from the boardroom to the elevator was the longest 300 feet of Julian Thorne's life. Usually, when he walked these halls, the air hummed with deference. Junior developers would stare at their shoes. Interns would flatten themselves against the walls to let him pass. Today, the open plan office was dead silent. Every head was turned toward him, but no one looked him in the eye. They had heard. In the age of Slack and blind carbon copies, news of a CEO's execution travels faster than light. Security was waiting at his desk, not the friendly guards who usually high-fived him. These were contractors, big silent men in cheap suits who handed him a cardboard box. "Personal items only, Mr. Thorne," one of them rumbled. "No electronics, no hard drives, no paper files." Julian stared at the box. It was humiliatingly small. He looked at his desk, the mahogany slab he had imported from Bali. He picked up a framed photo of him, shaking hands with the president. "That stays," the guard said. "Company property, promo material." Julian's face burned. He grabbed a stress ball and his Mont Blanc pen. "This is my pen," he hissed. "Take it," the guard said, bored. 10 minutes later, he was standing on the sidewalk of Market Street. It was starting to rain. His phone, his personal one, not the company secure line, which had already been remotely wiped, buzzed. It was a notification from his banking app. Transaction declined. Account frozen. "Annie," he muttered, the name tasting like ash. She had moved fast. The loan default clause. She had locked his liquidity, but he wasn't worried. Not yet. He had assets she couldn't touch. He had cashes. And he had Isabella. Isabella wasn't just a mistress. She was his exit strategy. She was 26, brilliant, and arguably more ruthless than he was. She was the one who had convinced him to file for divorce on Christmas. "Rip the Band-Aid off, baby," she had whispered in his ear. "We'll take the IPO money, start our own fund, and buy an island." He hailed a cab. His Uber account was linked to the corporate card, which was surely dead, and gave the address for the penthouse in the Millennium Tower. He had bought it under an LLC 3 months ago. Technically, it was corporate housing, but he treated it as his love nest. He needed a drink. He needed a plan. He needed Isabella to tell him that Annie was a bitter old hag, and that they would win in court. He keyed into the penthouse. "Bella? Baby?" The hallway was cluttered, not with the usual mess of designer shoeboxes, but with luggage. Louis Vuitton trunks were stacked by the door. Julian walked into the living room. Isabella was there, wearing a cashmere travel set, typing furiously on her phone. She didn't look up. "You heard," Julian said, loosening his tie. He walked toward the wet bar. "It's a nightmare. She ambushed me. It's a coup. But don't worry, I've got a lawyer who—" "I resigned," Isabella said. Julian stopped, the decanter of vodka in his hand. "What?" "I sent my resignation letter to HR 20 minutes ago, effective immediately." She finally looked up. Her eyes were dry. There was no sympathy in them, only calculation. That's good," Julian stammered. "Solidarity. We leave together. We'll start that fund sooner than we thought. I just need to access my offshore accounts and—" "Julian," she cut him off. "There is no we." She stood up and snapped her phone shut. "I just got off the phone with Marcus Sterling. He's staying on the board. He told me everything. Annie didn't just fire you. She invoked the bad actor clause in your vesting schedule. You know what that means, right?" Julian felt the room tilt. The bad actor clause. A clause he had insisted on putting into the employee contracts to punish executives who committed gross negligence. It stripped them of unvested equity. "She can't enforce that," Julian said, his voice rising. "I built that company." "She has the votes," Isabella said, checking her watch, "and she has the debt. You're not a billionaire anymore, Julian. You're a guy with a negative net worth and a massive lawsuit incoming." So? Julian stepped toward her. I'm still me. I'm still the visionary. We can rebuild. Isabella let out a short, sharp laugh. Visionary? Julian, the only reason I stuck around was because I thought you were the king. I didn't know you were the jester dancing for the queen. She signaled to the door, where a bellhop was waiting. I have a flight to catch. Dubai. A real visionary offered me a job running his PR. He's solvent. You're leaving me? Julian asked, disbelief shattering his arrogance. On the same day my wife destroys my life? Technically, Isabella said, pulling on her sunglasses. Your wife destroyed your life yesterday. You just didn't notice until today. That's why you lost. She walked past him, the scent of her expensive perfume lingering in the air like a taunt. At the door, she paused. Oh, and Julian, you might want to leave too. This apartment is owned by Thorn Dynamics. Annie's assistant just emailed me. They're changing the locks in an hour. The door clicked shut. Julian stood alone in the penthouse that wasn't his, holding a drink he couldn't pay for, while the rain hammered against the glass. He screamed. He threw the crystal tumbler against the million-dollar view, watching it shatter into 1,000 diamonds. But there was no one there to hear him. 3 weeks later. The Motel 6 near the San Francisco airport smelled of stale cigarettes and industrial cleaner. It was a far cry from the Four Seasons, but it was all Julian could afford with the cash he had managed to pawn from his watch collection. His lawyers, the cheap ones who advertised on billboards, were useless. Annie had buried them in paper. Every motion he filed was met with 3 counter-motions. She had frozen everything. He couldn't even access his LinkedIn profile. She had flagged it for impersonation of a corporate officer. He was erased. But Julian Thorne was not a man who went quietly into the night. He sat on the edge of the lumpy mattress, surrounded by empty takeout containers and tangled wires. The clean slate he had wanted so badly on Christmas Eve had arrived, but it looked more like a tomb. On the desk sat a black laptop, a burner he had bought at Best Buy with cash. She thinks she's the code master, Julian muttered, his eyes bloodshot. She thinks she knows the system. He did know one thing Annie didn't, or at least he hoped she didn't. 5 years ago, during a bout of paranoia induced by too much Adderall and sleepless nights, Julian had hired a shaded hacker from the dark web. He had paid him to install a dead man's switch in the core server architecture of Thorn Dynamics. It was a simple script. If Julian didn't log in and enter a specific biometric key every 30 days, the script would wake up. It wouldn't delete data. That was too obvious. Instead, it would introduce a subtle chaotic variable into the logistics algorithm. It would start misrouting shipments. It would send perishable goods to the wrong continent. It would create a cascading failure that would look like incompetence, not sabotage. The IPO was scheduled for tomorrow morning, the bell-ringing ceremony at the NYSE. If the switch triggered tonight, the stock would crash before the first trade was even made. Annie would be humiliated, the company would lose billions, and Julian would be the only one who could fix it. He would ransom the solution for his shares back. He checked the timer on the screen. Login required. 59. 59. He hadn't logged in for 29 days. In 1 hour, the chaos would begin. He cracked a smile. It was a jagged, manic thing. Merry Christmas, Annie. He opened a new browser window and navigated to the live stream of the Thorn Dynamics pre-IPO gala. It was happening right now at the De Young Museum. There she was, Annie. She looked breathtaking. She wasn't wearing the modest, professorial clothes she used to wear. She was wearing a midnight blue gown that hugged her curves, her hair swept up, diamonds dripping from her ears. She was holding a microphone, addressing a crowd of investors, journalists, and the traitorous board members. Julian turned up the volume on the cheap laptop speakers. "We are not just a logistics company," Annie was saying, her voice confident and warm. "We are the nervous system of the global economy, and for too long we operated with a blockage in our arteries." Laughter from the crowd. Julian grit his teeth. "But tonight," she continued, "we are flowing freely. I want to thank the team who stood by me during this transition, and I want to make a special announcement." Julian leaned in. "What now?" "Many of you know that my former partner, Julian Thorne, was the public face of this company. But few of you know the architecture behind it. The code." She gestured to the screen behind her. A complex visualization of data streams appeared. Julian believed in control. He believed in leverage. Which is why, she paused, looking directly into the camera as if she could see him in his motel room. He installed a chaotic script in our servers known as a dead man's switch. Julian froze. The blood drained from his face. "He intended for this script to activate tonight," Annie said calmly. A murmur of shock went through the crowd. "He wanted to hold our data hostage, to crash our systems because he couldn't control them." "How?" Julian whispered. "How does she know?" "But," Annie smiled, "Julian forgot who wrote the kernel. He forgot that you cannot hide a virus from the immune system. I found his little switch 4 years ago." On the screen behind her, a countdown clock appeared. It matched the one on Julian's laptop. 0:45. "Well, I didn't delete it," Annie explained. "I isolated it. I put it in a sandbox, a virtual simulation of our network. For the last 4 years, Julian has been controlling a dummy switch. He thought he had a gun to our heads. He was actually holding a water pistol." The crowd laughed. It was a deep, belly laugh that mocked Julian's very existence. "So," Annie said, raising her glass, "in 45 minutes, Julian's script will execute. And do you know what will happen? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. Except that we will have a record of his attempt to commit corporate terrorism, which I have already forwarded to the FBI." Julian slammed the laptop shut. He scrambled backward, knocking over a lamp. The FBI. He wasn't just broke. He wasn't just divorced. He was about to be a felon. He grabbed his duffel bag. He had to run. Where? Mexico? He had no passport. It was in the safe at the house. The house Annie controlled. He ran to the door of the motel room and threw it open. Standing there were 2 agents in windbreakers with FBI emblazoned on the back. Behind them, the red and blue lights of police cruisers washed over the parking lot. "Julian Thorne?" the lead agent asked. Julian looked past them, at the rainy night sky. He thought about the champagne in Aspen. He thought about the clean slate. "Yes," he whispered. "You have the right to remain silent," the agent recited, spinning him around and cuffing his hands behind his back. As they walked him to the car, Julian looked up at the billboard across the highway. It was a digital ad for the Thorne Dynamics IPO. Thorne Dynamics, the future is female. The tagline faded, replaced by Annie's face. She looked like a goddess of vengeance. Julian sat in the back of the cruiser. The realization hit him harder than the handcuffs. He hadn't just lost a wife. He had challenged the smartest woman he had ever met to a game of chess without realizing she had designed the board. And the game was over. The trial of United States verhost Julian Thorne was less of a legal proceeding and more of a public autopsy of a man's ego. Because of the high-profile nature of the IPO, which had launched successfully, valuing Thorne Dynamics at a staggering $4.2 billion, the judge allowed cameras in the courtroom. It was the most watched stream on YouTube for 3 weeks straight. Julian sat at the defense table, a shadow of his former self. His bespoke suits were gone, replaced by off-the-rack attire that hung loosely on his frame. His hair, once artfully greyed, was now just grey. He refused to look at the gallery. Annie sat in the front row every single day. She didn't gloat. She didn't smirk. She sat with the poise of a marble statue, taking notes in a leather-bound notebook. Her presence was a psychological weight that crushed Julian. The prosecution's case was a slam dunk. Annie had provided them with everything: the code logs, the emails Julian had sent to the dark web hacker, and the audio recordings of him bragging about his insurance policy to Isabella, who had turned state's witness in exchange for immunity. But the climax of the trial wasn't the evidence. It was when Julian took the stand. Against his lawyer's desperate advice, Julian insisted on testifying. He believed, even now, that he could charm the jury. He believed he could explain that he was the victim of a vindictive ex-wife. "Mr. Thorne," the prosecutor, a sharp woman named D.A. Reynolds, began, "you claim that the dead man's switch was a security measure to protect the company?" "Absolutely," Julian said, leaning into the microphone. "I was the founder. I needed to ensure that if I was incapacitated, the company couldn't be hijacked by hostile actors." "Hostile actors like your wife?" Reynolds asked. "My ex-wife," Julian corrected. "And yes, Annie Vance is a brilliant woman, I won't deny that. But she is vindictive. She orchestrated a coup. She stole my company." "Stole?" Reynolds walked over to the exhibit table. "Mr. Thorne, do you recognize this document?" She held up the original incorporation papers of Thorne Dynamics. "Yes, that's the founding document." "And whose signature is on the line for Chief Technical Architect and Majority IP Holder?" Julian hesitated. "Well, mine is on the CEO line." "Answer the question, Mr. Thorne." "Annie's," Julian mumbled. "And this document?" Reynolds held up the patent for the core algorithm, the ant colony logic. "Who is the sole inventor listed here?" "Annie Vance." "And the funding for the Series A? The money that kept the lights on in 2018? Who signed the check?" "The Orion Group." "And who owns the Orion Group?" "Annie Vance," Julian spat out. Reynolds turned to the jury. "So, Mr. Thorne, you didn't write the code, you didn't own the patent, you didn't provide the capital, and yet you felt entitled to destroy it all because your wife asked for a divorce?" "I built the brand," Julian shouted, standing up. "I was the face. No one cared about the math until I sold it. I made her rich. She was nothing but a calculator in a basement until I found her." The courtroom gasped. Even Julian's lawyer put his head in his hands. Reynolds smiled. She didn't need to say anything else. Julian had just proven her point. He was a narcissist who saw people as tools. Annie, sitting in the front row, finally made eye contact with him. She didn't look angry. She looked pitying, and that hurt Julian more than any verdict could. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. Guilty on all counts: corporate sabotage, attempted computer fraud, and wire fraud. The judge, a stern man who had zero tolerance for white-collar hubris, sentenced Julian to 8 years in federal prison. As the bailiffs led him away, Julian stopped. He looked at Annie. "Why?" he asked, his voice cracking. "You could have just divorced me. Why burn me to the ground?" Annie stood up. The courtroom went silent. "Because, Julian," she said, her voice carrying to the back of the room, "you mistook my silence for weakness. You mistook my love for blindness. And when you threatened the one thing we built together, you stopped being my husband. You became a bug in the system." She turned and walked out of the courtroom, the camera flashes illuminating her like lightning. "And I always debug my code." 2 years later. December 24th. The silence of the Aspen Chalet was different this time. 2 years ago, The silence had been a vacuum, a suffocating void left by a slamming door, and a marriage that had been dead for a decade. It had been the silence of a tomb. Tonight, the silence was heavy, but it was the good kind. It was the velvet quiet of a house that had just exhaled after a long, joyous day. It was the sound of a fire crackling in the hearth, the soft clink of cooling crystal, and the rhythmic, distant breathing of a sleeping child. Annie Vance stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, the same spot where she had watched Julian's taillights disappear into the snowstorm. She wore a robe of deep emerald velvet, wrapping it tight against the draft that always seemed to sneak in off the Rockies. Outside, the snow was falling again, thick, heavy flakes that coated the world in white. But unlike that night, Annie wasn't waiting for a car to return. She wasn't waiting for permission. She wasn't waiting for the other shoe to drop. She was simply watching the physics of the snow, appreciating the chaotic perfection of it. "You're thinking about him," a voice said from the shadows of the living room. Annie didn't turn. She smiled, seeing Arthur Penhaligon's reflection in the glass. The old lawyer was sitting in the wing-back chair, nursing a snifter of cognac. He looked older, his hair fully white now, but his eyes were as sharp as ever. "Not him, Arthur," Annie replied softly. "I'm thinking about the time. 2 years. It feels like a lifetime. In the corporate world, it is 3 lifetimes," Arthur chuckled. "You've done more in 8 quarters than Julian did in 8 years. The Financial Times piece this morning was complimentary." "The matriarch of Silicon Valley, was it?" Annie turned, walking back toward the fire. "They only call me that because they don't know what else to do with a female CEO who actually writes her own code. It scares them." "It inspires them," Arthur corrected gently. "The stock closed at $142 today. The Orion Initiative has funded 40 startups led by women in developing nations. You aren't just running a logistics company anymore, Annie. You're running an empire." She sat down on the sofa, tucking her legs under her. "It's funny. Julian always wanted the empire. He wanted the statues, the magazine covers, the applause. I just wanted the machine to work. I just wanted the logic to hold. And it does," Arthur said, "because you removed the glitch." The glitch. Julian. Annie glanced at the coffee table. There, resting on a silver tray, was a letter. The envelope was plain white, stamped with the ominous block letters of the Federal Correctional Institution, Sheridan. It had arrived 3 days ago. She hadn't opened it until tonight, after the guests had left. Linda Chen, who was now her COO, Marcus Sterling, who had grovelled his way back onto the board, only to be kept on a tight leash, and the kaleidoscope of friends she had made since emerging from Julian's shadow. Arthur followed her gaze. "You read it?" "I did." "And?" Annie picked up the envelope. The paper felt cheap and gritty between her manicured fingers. "He's teaching," she said. "Introduction to Business Ethics. Can you believe the irony?" Arthur let out a bark of laughter. The wolf teaching the sheep how not to get eaten. Poetic. "He says he's writing a book," Annie continued, sliding the letter out. She didn't need to read it. She had memorized the scrawl. "He says he finally understands the difference between leverage and loyalty." She looked at the handwritten words. Julian's handwriting had changed. It used to be sweeping, arrogant, taking up 3 lines for a single sentence. Now it was cramped, small, the handwriting of a man who lived in a 6x8 cell. "L," the letter read. "I have a lot of time to think in here. The silence is the hardest part. I used to hate silence. That's why I talked so much. That's why I needed the parties, the IPO, the noise. I was terrified that if the noise stopped, I'd realize I had nothing to say. I watched your interview on Bloomberg last week. You changed the routing algorithm for the Asia-Pacific sector. It was brilliant. I would have tried to buy a shipping fleet to fix the delay. You just changed the math. That was always the difference between us. I tried to force the world to fit me. You just understood how the world worked. I don't expect you to reply. I just wanted to say that for 20 years, I thought I was the protagonist of this story. I thought you were the supporting character. I see now that I was just the antagonist, and the antagonist always loses in the end. Merry Christmas. J. Annie folded the letter and placed it back on the tray. She didn't feel the surge of vindication she had felt in the courtroom. She didn't feel the sharp sting of betrayal anymore. She felt a strange, hollow pity. Julian was a man who had built a castle out of sand, and he was finally understanding the nature of the tide. "Do you forgive him?" Arthur asked, watching her closely. Annie picked up her glass of Krug. She swirled the golden liquid. "Forgiveness implies that I'm still holding on to the anger, Arthur. I'm not angry. I'm just finished. Here's a line of code I commented out. He's still there, in the history of the program, but he doesn't execute anymore." A soft cry came from the nursery down the hall. Annie's expression shifted instantly. The cool, analytical CEO vanished, replaced by a warmth that lit up her eyes. She stood up, smoothing her velvet robe. "Duty calls," she whispered. She walked down the hallway to the nursery. It was painted in soft creams and yellows, a stark contrast to the stark modernism of the rest of the house. In the crib, Clara was stirring. Annie reached down and lifted the 6-month-old baby into her arms. Clara had been adopted in June, a private adoption from a young mother in Ohio who wanted her daughter to have the world. Annie had promised her exactly that. She walked Clara over to the window. The baby blinked, her dark eyes focusing on the falling snow outside. "Look, Clara," Annie whispered, pressing her cheek against the baby's soft head. "It's just water. Frozen water. But when it falls together, it can cover mountains." Clara cooed, reaching out a tiny hand toward the cold glass. This was the variable Julian had never accounted for. He had assumed Annie's life ended with him. He had assumed she was too old, too cold, too technical to be a mother. But Annie had simply applied her logic to her own happiness. She had resources. She had love to give. She didn't need a partner to build a family. She just needed the will. "You're going to be an architect, little one," Annie murmured, rocking her gently. "Or an artist, or a chef. You can be whatever you want. Because no one is ever going to take credit for your work. I will make sure of that." She thought about the future. The IPO was just the beginning. The Orion Group was acquiring a quantum computing firm next month. She was rewriting the logistical map of the world. She was the most powerful woman in tech. But holding Clara, feeling the weight of this small life in her arms, was the only equity that mattered. She walked back into the living room, Clara resting on her shoulder. Arthur smiled, raising his glass in a silent toast. Annie walked to the fireplace. She picked up the letter from Julian with her free hand. For a moment, she hesitated. She could keep it. A trophy, a reminder of how far she had come. But Annie Vance didn't keep clutter. She optimized. She tossed the letter into the fire. She watched as the cheap prison paper curled. She watched Julian's cramped handwriting turn brown, then black, then dissolve into ash. The flames licked higher, fueled by the ghosts of the past, before settling back into a steady, comforting rhythm. "It's gone," Arthur noted. It was never really there, Annie replied. She turned away from the fire, facing the room, facing her daughter, facing the expansive, unwritten code of the rest of her life. "Arthur," she said, her voice clear and commanding, "open the 1996 Dom Perignon. The Krug is finished." "Celebrating something specific, Ma'am?" Annie kissed the top of Clara's head. "Yes," she said, "version 2.0. And there you have it, the rise, fall, and reinvention of the Thorn Empire. It's a story that proves one undeniable truth. The most dangerous person in the room isn't the one shouting the loudest. It's the one quietly doing the math. Julian thought he was the king, but he forgot that in chess, the queen is the most powerful piece on the board. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. And if you want more stories about corporate betrayal, hidden fortunes, and sweet revenge, make sure to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss an upload. What would you have done in Annie's shoes? Would you have burned the letter or kept it as a trophy? Let me know in the comments below. I'll be pinning the best answer. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.